Right now, at this exact moment, Russian-made S-500 Prometheus air defense systems are being deployed along Lebanon's southern border with Israel. The Israeli Defense Forces claim these represent the most advanced air defense technology on Earth, systems that Moscow has never exported to any nation, including its closest allies. Hezbollah's media wing posted footage this morning showing what appear to be massive TEL vehicles carrying radar arrays consistent with S-500 architecture. If confirmed, this marks the first time Russia's most sophisticated strategic defense system has appeared outside Russian territory, fundamentally altering the military balance across the entire Middle East. Let me walk you through exactly what happened. At 0427 hours local time on March 14, 2026, Israeli Air Force surveillance assets operating over northern Israel detected unusual convoy activity on Highway 51 approximately 8 kilometers north of the Lebanese town of Marjia. The convoy consisted of 6 heavy transport vehicles accompanied by what Israeli intelligence identified as Russian pattern security elements. By 0633 hours, the convoy reached deployment positions along a ridgeline overlooking the Galilee Panhandle, placing the systems within optimal engagement geometry for Israeli airspace. At 0712 hours, Hezbollah-affiliated Telegram channels published video footage showing personnel in non-standard uniforms conducting what appeared to be radar initialization procedures on equipment bearing visual characteristics matching S-500 deployment protocols. At 0745 hours, the Israeli Air Force scrambled 8 F-35I Adir stealth fighters from Nevatim and Ramon air bases, establishing combat air patrol patterns along the northern border at altitudes suggesting defensive rather than offensive posturing. At 0834 hours, Israeli Defense Minister issued a statement declaring the deployment an unacceptable escalation that crosses red lines established since the 2006 Lebanon War. At 0921 hours, Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson responded that Russia maintains sovereign right to conduct military cooperation with partners, without confirming or denying S-500 presence. At 1045 hours, U.S. Central Command sources speaking to Reuters indicated American intelligence is working to verify system identity through satellite imagery and signals intelligence. As of this recording, neither definitive photographic evidence nor electronic signature confirmation has been publicly released, leaving critical verification questions unresolved even as military posturing intensifies. To understand why this deployment represents a strategic earthquake, you need to understand what the S-500 Prometheus actually is. This is not an incremental improvement over existing air defense technology. The S-500 represents a generational leap in anti-air and anti-missile capability that fundamentally changes engagement calculus across an entire theater of operations. The system officially designated 55R6M Triumphator-M by Russian designation carries the NATO reporting name SA-X-30. Development began in 2002 with deployment to Russian strategic sites, beginning in 2021. The S-500 employs dual-band radar systems operating in both X-band and L-band frequencies, providing detection capabilities against targets from ultra-low altitude nap-of-the-earth cruise missiles up to ballistic missiles in near-space trajectories. The system can simultaneously track up to 10 ballistic missile targets traveling at speeds exceeding Mach 20 while engaging them at ranges up to 600 kilometers. For aircraft and cruise missile targets, engagement range extends to 500 kilometers with the ability to track 100 targets simultaneously and engage 36 of them. The missile interceptors themselves come in 2 variants. The 77N6N missile handles exo-atmospheric intercepts against ballistic missiles at altitudes up to 200 kilometers. The 77N6N1 variant handles endo-atmospheric intercepts against aircraft, cruise missiles, and hypersonic weapons at altitudes from ground level to 35 kilometers. Each missile achieves velocities exceeding Mach 7 during terminal engagement phase. The system's command post designated 55K6MA can network with other air defense systems, creating integrated coverage that eliminates gaps exploitable by stealth aircraft or saturation attacks. What makes this particularly devastating for Israeli air operations is the S-500's reported capability against stealth aircraft. Russian designers specifically engineered the system to detect and engage fifth-generation fighters like the F-35 by employing long-wavelength radar frequencies that reduce stealth coding effectiveness. Whether these capabilities match Russian claims remains untested in combat, but Israeli planners cannot afford to assume Russian systems perform below specification. Compare this to existing air defense architecture in Lebanon. Hezbollah currently operates a mix of short-range systems including Russian-origin SA-6 Gainful, SA-8 Gecko, and Iranian-developed systems based on Chinese HQ-7 technology. These systems provide point defense against aircraft and helicopters, but lack the range, altitude capability, and sophistication to challenge Israeli air superiority across Lebanese airspace. Israel has conducted hundreds of strikes against targets in Lebanon and Syria over the past decade with near-complete impunity because existing air defenses could not effectively contest Israeli operations. The deployment of even one S-500 battery fundamentally alters this equation. A single battery positioned on the ridgelines of southern Lebanon achieves radar horizon coverage extending deep into Israeli airspace, potentially as far south as Tel Aviv under optimal atmospheric conditions. Israeli aircraft taking off from Ramat David, Hatzerim, and Nevatim air bases would immediately fall within S-500 engagement envelope. Strike packages assembling over Israeli territory could be tracked, targeted, and potentially engaged before ever crossing into Lebanese airspace. This forces Israeli air operations into three unpalatable choices. Avoid Lebanese airspace entirely, accept dramatically higher aircraft loss rates, or conduct suppression of enemy air defense missions that risk expanding conflict into direct confrontation with Russian advisors operating the systems. The strategic implications cascade across multiple dimensions of regional security. From Israel's perspective, this deployment represents an existential threat to the air superiority that forms the foundation of Israeli defense doctrine. The Israeli Defense Forces built their entire strategic approach around qualitative military edge achieved through technological superiority and freedom of aerial maneuver. Israeli doctrine assumes the ability to strike targets anywhere in the region with acceptable risk to pilots and aircraft. S-500 deployment threatens this assumption fundamentally. If Israel cannot suppress or destroy these systems through conventional strike operations without prohibitive losses, the entire strategic framework underpinning Israeli security calculations collapses. From Russia's perspective, deploying S-500 systems to Lebanon serves multiple strategic objectives. It demonstrates Russian commitment to allies in the Middle East at a time when American credibility faces questions following chaotic Afghanistan withdrawal and inconsistent Syria policy. It provides real-world testing environment for S-500 capabilities against sophisticated Western aircraft and tactics, generating operational data impossible to obtain through domestic exercises. It creates leverage over Israeli operations in Syria, where Russia maintains bases and equities requiring protection from Israeli strikes targeting Iranian forces. According to Dr. Jeffrey Edmonds, former Russia director at the National Security Council and current researcher at the Center for Naval Analyses, Russian military exports increasingly serve strategic signaling functions beyond simple revenue generation. Edmonds argues that Moscow uses advanced system deployments to allied nations as mechanisms for extending deterrent coverage and constraining adversary freedom of action. From Iran's perspective, S-500 presence in Lebanon dramatically strengthens deterrent posture against potential Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities or Revolutionary Guard assets. Tehran has invested decades building Hezbollah into a strategic deterrent force capable of launching thousands of rockets at Israeli cities if Iran itself comes under attack. S-500 systems protecting Hezbollah's launch infrastructure make that deterrent more credible by reducing Israel's ability to conduct the kind of systematic air campaign that would be necessary to suppress rocket fire before it could inflict mass civilian casualties. According to Michael Knights, Jill and Jay Bernstein Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Hezbollah has transformed from guerrilla force into a quasi-conventional military with growing emphasis on sophisticated air defense integration. Knights notes that Hezbollah personnel have trained extensively with Russian advisors in Syria operating S-300 and Panzer systems defending Russian bases at Tartus and Khmeimim. This training provides foundation for potentially operating S-500 systems under Russian technical supervision. However, multiple defense analysts emphasize that S-500 operational complexity likely precludes independent Hezbollah operation without direct Russian crew involvement. The system requires sophisticated signal processing, engagement coordination, and threat assessment that demands years of specialized training. According to retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Mike Pietraha, writing for the Mitchell Institute, modern strategic air defense systems like S-500 represent weapon systems where operator quality matters as much as hardware capability. Pietraha argues that Russian crews operating S-500 batteries in Lebanon would perform substantially better than even well-trained Hezbollah personnel, but also creates tripwire where Israeli strikes potentially kill Russian military personnel, escalating conflict beyond regional parameters into direct Russian-Israeli confrontation. This situation echoes historical precedents that ended poorly. During the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Egypt achieved initial tactical success partially through employment of Soviet-supplied SA-6 air defense systems that shot down Israeli aircraft at rates far exceeding previous conflicts. The SA-6's mobility and resistance to existing Israeli countermeasures forced adaptation of Israeli tactics mid-conflict at significant cost. During the 1982 Lebanon War, Israel conducted Operation Mole Cricket 19, destroying 19 Syrian SAM batteries in the Bekaa Valley through a sophisticated suppression campaign involving drones, electronic warfare, and precision strikes. However, that operation targeted SA-6 and SA-8 systems far less capable than S-500, operated by Syrian crews with inferior training and coordination. The current situation more closely parallels the 1967 War of Attrition, where Soviet crews directly operated Egyptian air defense systems along the Suez Canal. Israeli strikes against these positions in 1970 resulted in Soviet pilot casualties, nearly triggering direct Soviet-Israeli confrontation that was only avoided through American diplomatic intervention. The difference today is that Russia's geopolitical position is far stronger than Soviet Union's was in 1970, while American willingness to expend political capital constraining Israeli military action appears substantially weaker. There are three scenarios for how this develops, each with distinct probability and trajectory. Scenario 1 is diplomatic de-escalation through Russian agreement to withdraw or deactivate systems in exchange for Israeli concessions on Syria operations. Probability assessment, 30%. For this pathway to succeed, Russia would need to conclude that S-500 deployment achieved its signaling objectives and maintaining deployment risks costs exceeding benefits. Israel would need to offer something Moscow values more than continued system presence, likely commitments to reduce strikes on Russian-protected sites in Syria or acceptance of Russian mediation role in regional disputes. The United States would need to broker this arrangement through high-level diplomacy, possibly involving Secretary of State discussions with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. This scenario requires all parties to prioritize de-escalation over maximalist objectives and accept compromise positions. The window for diplomatic resolution extends approximately 7 to 10 days from deployment, after which domestic political pressures and military momentum make backing down politically costly for all actors. Key enablers include immediate high-level diplomatic engagement, Russian signals indicating flexibility on deployment duration, and Israeli restraint from immediate military action. Scenario 2 is Israeli military action to destroy S-500 batteries through suppression campaign accepting higher loss rates. Probability assessment, 45%. If Israel concludes that diplomatic paths will not produce acceptable outcomes and that S-500 presence represents intolerable threat to long-term security, military action becomes the most likely response. This scenario would begin with Israeli diplomatic notifications to Russia through military-to-military channels attempting to minimize Russian casualties. Israel would likely conduct the operation using standoff weapons including Delilah cruise missiles, Spice precision-guided bombs released for maximum range, and potentially Arrow, 3 ballistic missile interceptors employed in surface-to-surface mode against static targets. The goal would be destroying S-500 radar arrays, command posts, and launcher vehicles before systems achieve full operational capability. Russian crews would receive warnings allowing evacuation, but combat operations inherently risk casualties regardless of intentions. If Russian personnel are killed, Moscow faces domestic political pressure to respond, potentially through increased arms transfers to regional actors, cyber operations against Israeli infrastructure, or diplomatic campaigns isolating Israel in international forums. This scenario produces short-term Israeli tactical success at the cost of long-term strategic deterioration in Russian-Israeli relations and potential expansion of Russian military involvement, supporting Iranian equities across the region. The operation would likely occur within 72 to 96 hours if chosen, before S-500 batteries achieve full operational integration with Lebanese air defense networks. Scenario 3 is Russian activation of S-500 systems leading to attrition warfare and regional conflict expansion. Probability assessment, 25%. In this nightmare trajectory, S-500 batteries achieve operational status and begin actively engaging Israeli aircraft conducting routine operations or strike missions. Initial engagements might target drones or aircraft in Lebanese airspace, establishing operational parameters without directly striking targets over Israeli territory. Israel responds with suppression attempts that fail to destroy systems due to mobility and defensive positioning. S-500 batteries begin engaging Israeli aircraft over Israeli airspace, forcing cessation of northern air operations. Hezbollah interprets this as strategic shift enabling expanded operations, beginning rocket attacks on northern Israeli communities. Israel responds with ground incursion into southern Lebanon attempting to destroy launch sites, but operations proceed without air cover due to S-500 threat, resulting in substantially higher Israeli casualties than previous Lebanon operations. Iran activates militia forces in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen conducting strikes on American and Israeli interests. Regional war expands beyond Israeli-Hezbollah conflict into multilateral confrontation involving direct Russian-Israeli combat, Iranian-American escalation, and potential closure of critical maritime choke points, including Bab al-Mandab and Strait of Hormuz. This catastrophic scenario becomes likely only if multiple miscalculations occur simultaneously, but history demonstrates that complex crises often produce exactly these kinds of compounding failures. Watch for 5 critical indicators in the next 48 to 72 hours that will reveal which scenario is materializing. First, satellite imagery analysis from commercial providers, including Maxar and Planet Labs. If imagery shows S-500 vehicles dispersing from initial deployment positions into hardened sites or camouflaged locations, this indicates Russian commitment to sustained deployment rather than temporary signaling exercise. If vehicles remain concentrated in exposed positions, this suggests potential for negotiated withdrawal. Second, Israeli military mobilization patterns. If Israel activates reserve units specializing in suppression of enemy air defense or positions artillery within range of southern Lebanon, offensive action probability increases dramatically. If Israeli Air Force maintains defensive patrol patterns without forward positioning strike assets, diplomatic track remains viable. Third, Russian diplomatic communications through both official and back-channel mechanisms. If Moscow indicates willingness to discuss deployment parameters or suggests temporary activation timeline, de-escalation becomes possible. If Russia insists on permanent deployment as sovereign decision requiring no justification, military confrontation probability increases. Fourth, American diplomatic engagement level. If Secretary of State or National Security Advisor travel to region for direct negotiations, this signals American assessment that situation requires highest-level intervention to prevent military escalation. If American response remains limited to spokesperson statements and routine diplomatic contacts, Washington may assess situation as manageable through existing channels or maybe declining involvement. Fifth, Hezbollah public messaging and military posturing. If Hezbollah emphasizes defensive nature of systems and restraint in activation, This suggests organization seeks to avoid providing Israel with justification for strikes. If Hezbollah rhetoric becomes triumphalist, claiming new strategic balance, this indicates potential for provocative actions testing Israeli responses. The S-500 deployment represents the most significant shift in Middle Eastern military balance since Iran's ballistic missile program achieved precision strike capability in 2020. For decades, Israeli air superiority represented uncontested reality that shaped all regional actors' strategic calculations. Adversaries built military capabilities around assumption that Israeli aircraft could strike anywhere at any time, forcing reliance on concealment, dispersal, and hardening rather than active air defense. This deployment challenges that fundamental assumption. If S-500 systems remain operational, Israeli Air Force loses freedom of action that has defined regional security architecture since 1967. The implications extend far beyond Lebanon. Every regional actor will recalculate deterrence equations based on new reality where advanced Russian air defense technology can be deployed protecting Iranian nuclear sites, Syrian chemical weapons facilities, or Iraqi militia headquarters. The precedent matters as much as the immediate tactical reality. I'm monitoring this situation minute by minute through satellite imagery providers, defense intelligence analysis networks, and regional media sources in Hebrew, Arabic, and Russian. When the next development breaks, whether it's Israeli strike authorization, Russian diplomatic signals, or Hezbollah activation announcements, you will understand the implications here before mainstream media even identifies the story. Subscribe to this channel right now and activate all notifications. You need to know what happens next because this situation determines whether the Middle East experiences another decade of frozen conflict or descends into regional war that draws in great powers. Hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment with your analysis. Do you think Russia will withdraw these systems if diplomatic pressure intensifies, or is this deployment permanent? Do you think Israel will conduct strikes accepting the risk of Russian casualties, or will Jerusalem accept new strategic reality? Do you think S-500 capabilities against stealth aircraft match Russian claims, or are these systems vulnerable to suppression tactics Israel has refined over decades? I read every comment, and your perspectives matter because this community includes defense professionals, regional experts, and informed observers whose collective analysis often identifies developments before official sources confirm them. The next 72 hours determine everything. Russian-made strategic air defense systems sit 8 kilometers from the Israeli border. Israeli F-35s patrol northern airspace. Hezbollah controls the ground where these systems deploy. One miscalculation, one unauthorized engagement, one political decision made under pressure transforms regional military balance permanently. Thanks for watching. Stay informed. The clock is ticking.